wars and coups and bombs and regime change operations and support for paramilitaries and juntas and dictators, none of this has made us safer. And none of it has burnished our leadership or our moral authority. And more importantly, we must ask ourselves, is this really who we are?
In this video, we're going to look at a very recent speech from Robert F. Kennedy Jr., which I think gives a great insight into some of his philosophies, which are very interesting and also very important in these crazy times. Moreover, at the end, I'm going to give a few thoughts as to where I disagree with him and where I think that his policies and him as a candidate are a little bit questionable. So really looking forward to hearing your thoughts. Let's get into it.
I'm speaking to you today because the world is once again at a very similar crossroads. As in my uncle's time, nuclear tensions are at an extreme and dangerous level. As in his time, we have a unique opportunity not only to diffuse those tensions, but to take a radically different path, a path towards peace. My uncle's commitment to peace bore fruit in the Limited Test Ban Treaty of August 1963. But his assassination that November turned the nation down another path. His successors have launched one war after another, along with the ceaseless expansion of our military. Some call it the forever war. Americans used to identify herself as a peaceful nation. In fact, the framers of our Constitution said that believed that democracy was inconsistent with an imperium abroad, that if we tried to make ourselves an imperial nation abroad, that we would turn into a surveillance state, a garrison state, a security state at home, and that we would also destroy our economy. We would drain it, as happens with every empire. Every empire ends itself through the expansion of the military, overexpansion of its military abroad. And the founders knew that. John Quincy Adams spoke for all of them when he said, "America goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy." Today, I want to recall that memory because this forever war, which has so drained our nation's vitality, now threatens to plunge the world into the unspeakable horror of nuclear Armageddon. And I speak, of course, of the situation in Ukraine. I abhor Russia's brutal and bloody invasion of that nation. But we must understand that our government has also contributed to its circumstances through repeated, deliberate provocations of Russia going back to the 1990s. Democratic and Republican administrations have pushed NATO to Russia's borders, violating our own solemn promise from the early 90s when we pledged that if Russia made this terrible concession of moving 400,000 troops out of East Germany and allowing the unification of Germany under a NATO army, a hostile army, that we would commit that after that we would not move NATO 1 inch to the east. And James Baker gave that assurance, as did the British government officials and many, many others. And yet today we have surrounded Russia. We have moved it not 1 inch to the east, but 1,000 miles and 14 nations. We have surrounded Russia with missiles and military bases, something that we would never tolerate if the Russians did that to us. And statements from our government officials and think tanks lay out the goals for the Ukraine war: regime change in Russia, the overthrow of Vladimir Putin. This is what President Biden has said is our purpose in the Ukraine. The disabling and exhaustion of the Russian military and the dismembering of the Russian Federation. None of these objectives have anything to do with helping the Ukraine, which of course was the pretext for our involvement in the war. That's when our leaders told us that we were there for a humanitarian mission, but they've since acknowledged that there is a broader geopolitical agenda and that Ukraine is simply a pawn in a proxy war between the United States and Russia. Like teenagers playing World of Warcraft, these warmongers inside US leadership draw up war games and scenarios and pretend that a nuclear war is winnable. That is a dangerous lie.
So like he's alluded to here, the NATO expansion is basically the reason why this war is happening. They broke their promises to Russia. They said that they wouldn't move an inch to the east. And like he said, they've moved a lot more than that to the east. And obviously everyone is saying that Putin's invasion was completely immoral and that it wasn't justified. And it's like, yeah, I mean, there are hundreds and thousands of people who are dying because of this war. It's an absolutely devastating tragedy. But just imagine for a second, say that you're living in the US, that the BRICS alliance, or just China and Russia for that matter, made a deal that they wouldn't expand their militaries, but then started pushing further and further and further towards the West with blatantly anti-Western rhetoric. And then all of a sudden, they've got weapons on the borders at Mexico and Canada. There is absolutely no doubt whatsoever that the USA would react to it. It is a no-brainer. Yet if anybody tries to bring this up, as Tucker Carlson was doing, then they are labeled as a Putin apologist and they don't care about the suffering of the people in Ukraine. And here is where I agree with RFK massively. Here's a guy who's saying there is a way out of this conflict and there is a way to avoid these conflicts. But a part of that is looking inwards and understanding the role that we have played to create this conflict, rather than just propagating the narrative that Putin is a bloodthirsty monster who wants to be king of the world. But before we get to the next clip, guys, if you don't mind chucking a like on the video, RFK content is getting censored pretty badly at the moment, so it helps me with the algorithm. And obviously, if you want to subscribe to the channel, I'd love to have you. Back to the clips.
Can you imagine the consequence of a full nuclear exchange? President Kennedy did. That's why he said, quote, above all, while defending our own vital interests, nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either humiliating retreat of a nuclear war. To adopt that kind of course in the nuclear age would be evidence of the bankruptcy of our policy or a collective death wish for humanity. Let me say that again. Nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. The shameful fact is that for the last 20 years, the advocates of a militaristic foreign policy within the US leadership have done exactly the opposite. Their belligerent strategy of maximum confrontation extends beyond Russia to China, where the same group within our government hopes to use Taiwan as a geopolitical pawn, the same way they used Iraq and Syria and now Ukraine, to further a vain fantasy of world domination through violent confrontation.
So there was a lot said there, and one of the most important parts was the bit where he mentions that you do not want to get to the stage where there is two options. A leader can either do a humiliating retreat or engage in nuclear war. You don't want to do this with any leader, let alone Putin, because the latter becomes increasingly possible. There is absolutely no way that Putin would for 1 second allow his legacy to be as the guy who backed down to the US and the guy who had to surrender in shame. I don't see him doing that. I think he would rather die. Moreover, RFK used the term proxy war, and that's exactly what is happening here. They are using Ukraine as a way of overthrowing Putin and as a way of creating regime change in Russia. And Joe Biden and others have explicitly said this. But the narrative we see is that Putin just invaded Ukraine because he just wants the territory, because he's a maniac, and that the West just heroically came to poor little Ukraine's defense. And all of that money that's being poured into Ukraine is definitely not being embezzled by politicians. No. It's all going to helping Ukraine, a thriving democracy, hitherto this invasion. And this is definitely not just another democracy spreading mission by the US. You know, those democracy spreading missions and all of the great results they've been yielding? And then RFK mentioned Taiwan and China, and he alluded to the fact that we are potentially being butted up here for another proxy war, but with China. And instead of using Ukraine, they're now using Taiwan. And this, to me, is equally, if not more scary. It seems as though the opponents are getting bigger and bigger, and the threat is getting worse and worse. And if you look at the One China policy, for example, it's a policy that's been there for about the last 50 years or so, where in short, the US and China agreed that Taiwan is a part of China, and neither of the countries would do anything drastic to try and change that. And this has largely kept the peace over the last 50 years. And China has held that position, but the US is keen to now do away with it, which is obviously going to escalate tensions. And China is not thrilled about this. And if you guys want to learn more about that situation, I went to Taiwan and I spoke to the people of Taiwan about the threat from China. So if you want to watch that, I'll leave that in the comments and I'll recommend it at the end. But whatever your opinion on the matter and whatever your opinion on China, this is a terrible idea. We do not want to go to war with these nations. A war with China would probably be a lot worse than a war with Russia and would almost definitely drag a lot of other countries into it. So let's check out one more clip and then I'm going to give a few of my thoughts regarding question marks that I have around RFK.
Let's leave off geopolitics for a moment and take the matter of war and peace a little deeper. President Kennedy understood that peace begins with our basic attitudes and beliefs. He spoke of the futility of passively waiting for the other side to become enlightened. We, quote, "We must examine our own attitudes," he said, "as individuals and as a nation, for our attitude is as essential to theirs." End quote. We should, he said, begin by looking inward. Yes, back in 1963, a politician really said that. A political leader voiced what would be considered today a spiritual maximum or a spiritual principle. Let's take up that call from 60 years ago and ask Americans, all of us, to re-examine our attitude. We have been immersed in a foreign policy discourse that is all about adversaries and threats and allies and enemies and domination. We've become addicted to comic book good versus evil narratives that erase complexity and blind us to the legitimate motives and the legitimate cultural and economic concerns and the legitimate security concerns of other peoples and other nations. We have internalized and institutionalized a reflex of violence as the response for any and all crises. Everything becomes a war. The war on drugs, the war on terror, the war on cancer, the war on climate change. This way of thinking predisposes us to wage endless wars abroad, wars and coups and bombs and drones and regime change operations and support for paramilitaries and juntas and dictators. None of this has made us safer, and none of it has burnished our leadership or our moral authority. But more importantly, we must ask ourselves, is this really who we are? Is this what we want to be? Is that what Americans' founders envisioned? Here's another spiritual principle, one that my uncles also referred to, when he said, quote, "We are both caught up in a vicious and dangerous cycle, with suspicion on one side breeding suspicion on the other, and new weapons begetting counterweapons. When we hold others in the belief that they are implacable enemies, they tend to mold themselves accordingly to our view of them. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy or prediction that launches all players into a cycle of suspicion that my uncle warned against. Inhabiting the role of an enemy, we empower hardliners in places like Russia, China, Cuba, and Iran. We invite them into the drama of conflict, the drama of provocation and counter-provocation, of weapon and counter-weapon. Is it any wonder that as America has waged violence throughout the world, violence has overtaken us in our own nation?
So fascinating stuff there, and it's amazing to see somebody who has the balls to say this stuff. And Pretty poetic, actually, that his last name is Kennedy. But he's up against some seriously powerful forces here, and this is why he's getting censored so much. Forces that make a lot of money and stand to lose a whole lot if he is elected and if he does the things he says he wants to do. Big Pharma, the military-industrial complex, just to name a few. So for those reasons, I don't really see him getting anywhere in this campaign. But I guess they didn't think that Trump was going to win either. So my concerns with RFK are as follows, and I'm very interested to hear all of your thoughts on this. So obviously, I really like his stance on Big Pharma and on peace and avoiding war, and I like the fact that he calls out central bank digital currencies. But one of the things that I worry about is his environmentalism. And I think that we should be good stewards of the land, and I think that environmentalism is very important. But he is very anti-nuclear and very pro-renewable. And obviously, we don't have the infrastructure to do a full renewable economy. Furthermore, I believe most of the politicians and most of the big interests pushing climate change are very, very disingenuous. And I believe that much of the time, people use this as a scare tactic to gain power. And I worry that RFK would potentially get pushed around by globalists and by the World Economic Forum types. The next one, when he talked to Jordan Peterson, which YouTube took down for some reason, they were discussing the idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And he actually didn't even really know what the acronym stood for. And JP needed to actually clarify it for him, which was quite concerning for me. I believe that the DEI movement is modern day Marxism. It is a cancer to our institutions and is something that needs to be proactively fought and with urgency, and that reinstilling Western values is of utmost importance. And there are some extremely slimy characters in the Democratic Party, individuals that are ideologically very far to the left. And I would hope that RFK would be able to rein these individuals in. But I think that he's very busy and very focused on regulating industry. So I'm not sure how much he actually cares about this issue. And lastly, on breaking points, he said that he is pro-abortion and that this should be something that is the mother's choice. And I haven't heard him say anything else about this. Like, what, does he support third trimester? Is it always the mother's choice? What exactly are we talking about here? And I think that when it comes to winning the Democrat vote, every candidate needs to be pro-abortion because it's such a polarizing issue. And I think that that's genuinely an issue that could swing the election. So maybe he truly believes that, but I'm not too sure. Anyways, guys, that's it from me. If you guys want to watch another video, click right here. Until next time, I'm Jake. This is Rattlesnake TV, keeping you armed and dangerous.